Breaking news from this heart of West Africa has stirred global attention. Something unprecedented has just unfolded in Burkina Faso. This isn't merely a domestic affair. It's a challenge to decades of financial domination. President Ibrahim Traoré, young yet resolute, stood before the cameras this morning with a calm fury in his eyes behind him. The national flag swayed gently, and on the table beside him lay documents that carried the weight of betrayal. Today, he began. We unmask 50 years of deception. This was not rhetoric. It was revolution. Everything had started with a quiet internal audit. A special commission under the Ministry of Finance, composed of young, sharp-minded economists, had taken a closer look at Burkina Faso's historical agreements with the World Bank. What they discovered shook them to the core. Since gaining independence, Burkina Faso had borrowed billions, yet paid back far more in interest. According to the Commission's report, the country had repaid 15 times its original debt on paper. But the actual benefit to the nation? Barely measurable. Hospitals, roads, schools, projects supposedly funded had no physical trace. Many of these developments existed only in ink and signatures. Their funds vanished through complex webs of kickbacks and offshore transfers. Worse still, a classified protocol from 2019 revealed that 40% of the nation's gold reserves had been pledged as collateral to the World Bank, without parliamentary approval. One cannot overstate the gravity of such a revelation. The documents bore names of officials, bank seals, and even signatures from international agents. President Traoré, upon receiving the report, reportedly locked himself in his study for hours. When he emerged, he summoned the regional director of the World Bank to the presidential palace. James Morrison, a seasoned diplomat and bureaucrat, arrived in Ouagadougou believing he was attending a standard review meeting. He was wrong. Traoré was already waiting. No entourage, no advisors, just files and fury. He stood face to face with Morrison and said, "I have before me every piece of evidence proving that your institution has drained this nation's lifeblood. Fake projects, imaginary loans, absurd interest. We've paid $23 billion on a $4 billion debt. What kind of logic governs such theft?" When Morrison attempted to respond, Traoré raised his hand. "Spare me the procedures. This ends today. Cancel our debt, return what you've stolen, or face legal action for economic war crimes." Morrison, stunned, invoked diplomatic immunity, but Traoré didn't budge. There is no immunity for genocide, especially economic genocide, and with that, a door opened not just in Burkina Faso but across the African continent. Outside the palace, the wind carried whispers of a coming storm, but inside, history was being rewritten. The silence between President Traoré and James Morrison was heavy, not with diplomacy, but with reckoning. It wasn't a conversation, it was a confrontation. Traoré slowly opened the top folder, laying the documents out one by one. Every page revealed a new wound. Secret contracts signed in foreign hotels, agreements never ratified by Parliament, bribes hidden as development grants. With each sheet, Morrison's posture sank lower. The room was no longer his to navigate. "You speak of development," Traoré said, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "Yet our children still study under trees. Our hospitals lack medicine. Tell me, where did the development go?" Morrison could not answer. He didn't have to. The documents had already spoken louder than any defense. That night, Traoré called an emergency press conference in the palace garden. Journalists from across Africa and beyond gathered under the dim lights, their voices hushed, their cameras poised. Behind Traoré stood the flag of Burkina Faso and a portrait of Thomas Sankara, his ideological predecessor and martyr of independence. "Brothers and sisters," he began, addressing not just his citizens, but all of Africa. "We are here today to end 50 years of deception. The age of silent plunder is over. Our fathers were tricked, our grandfathers betrayed, but we, the children of Africa, will no longer be silent." He held up the damning documents to the cameras. After him. Fake project approvals, bank transfers to private European accounts, emails instructing local officials to remain silent or lose funding. As the images were broadcast across the continent, the reaction was immediate. In the streets of Ouagadougou, thousands gathered, chanting, singing, weeping. Women banged pots and pans in defiance. University students painted slogans on walls. We want our gold back. And then the spark jumped borders. In Mali, President Assimi Goïta became the first leader to publicly support Traoré, stating, "Burkina Faso is not alone. We too have suffered under the same system. The time for unity has come." In Niger, Abdourahmane Chiani called for a joint Sahel alliance to challenge the World Bank's legacy. Across Africa, voices once muffled by fear now found strength in Traoré's stand. But not everyone celebrated. In Paris, alarms rang through diplomatic channels. President Macron's advisors moved quickly, dispatching envoys to Ouagadougou. Their message was simple: calm things down, don't break the system. But Traoré refused to meet them. He sent back a note instead. "First, we will deal with the World Bank. Then we will speak of colonial debts." Meanwhile, in Washington, the World Bank's leadership entered panic mode. President Ajay Banga called an emergency meeting of regional directors. Emails leaked later would reveal the scale of their fear. One line read, "If this gains momentum, we could lose our African portfolio entirely." Indeed, the tremors were already spreading. Commentators, if you're still with us, pause for a second. What would your leader do in such a moment? Would they stand tall for truth or bow to silence? Let us know your thoughts. Your voice matters in moments like this. As night fell on Burkina Faso, the streets remained alive. Bonfires lit up city squares. Music of resistance echoed through neighborhoods. Young people recited poems in honor of Traoré. Old women, eyes filled with tears, whispered prayers for his protection. And above it all, one truth loomed clear. This wasn't just about debt, it was about dignity. As dawn broke over Ouagadougou, the headlines told a story no one could ignore. Burkina Faso declares economic liberation. The world had seen protests before, but this felt different. It wasn't just an outcry, it was a declaration. Inside the presidential palace, Traoré was already in motion. He issued an order to seal all World Bank offices across the country. Security forces moved swiftly. Vaults were locked. Servers were seized. What they found inside would deepen the wound and strengthen the case. Boxes filled with internal memos, handwritten notes, confidential reports, evidence that decades of economic policy had been less about growth and more about control. But the real earthquake came from Morrison's confiscated laptop, encrypted files, personal correspondences, a folder titled Continental Strategies. Within it, a document surfaced bearing a chilling name: How to Keep Poor Countries in Debt Forever. The contents were shocking even to the most cynical observers. It laid out a detailed blueprint: how to structure loans that could never be repaid, how to manipulate local media to suppress dissent, how to groom officials into complicity, and how to use poverty as leverage. Names were listed, amounts transferred, banks identified, even plans to destabilize uncooperative governments, coup plots, assassination lists. It was a confession, typed, dated, and digitally signed. President Traoré ordered the files to be forwarded to the International Criminal Court. "This is not just about Burkina Faso," he said. "This is a global crime against the dignity of our continent." As news spread, support poured in from all directions. The African Union convened an emergency summit in Addis Ababa. 41 of the 53 member states signed a joint resolution backing Burkina Faso and calling for a full review of their ties with international lenders. The president of the African Development Bank spoke with uncommon boldness. Africa must build its own financial institutions. We cannot develop under the shadow of others' interests. Western media, caught off guard, struggled to frame the story. CNN described Traoré as a populist with dangerous ambitions. BBC warned of looming economic catastrophe. Financial Times went further. Burkina Faso risks isolation. But African media told it straight: this is not rebellion, this is justice. In cities across the continent, solidarity movements erupted. In Accra, students filled university halls demanding a similar audit. In Abidjan, crowds gathered outside foreign embassies holding signs that read, "We are next." And in Dakar, a retired school teacher said it best in an interview: "We were told these debts were our path to progress, but all they brought was silence and shame. Today we have found our voice again." Social media exploded. Hashtags like hashtag Africa Rises, hashtag Traoré Truth, and hashtag Cancel the Debt top trends from Nairobi to Lagos. Thousands posted old photos of Thomas Sankara beside images of Traoré, captioning them. The dream lives on. Even outside Africa, the ripple effect was felt. In Paris, African diaspora communities organized mass rallies. In London, students marched through Hyde Park chanting, "Traoré speaks for us all." In New York, African Americans joined hands in Harlem, lighting candles and singing old liberation hymns. This was not just about Burkina Faso. This was about every nation that had been told to stay quiet, to be patient, to follow instructions while watching its wealth disappear. And at the center of it all, Ibrahim Traoré stood unmoved, calm in the storm he had lit. While the streets of Ouagadougou pulsed with chants of defiance, boardrooms across the West trembled in silence. The World Bank's Crisis Committee, meeting behind closed doors in Washington, realized they were no longer dealing with just a regional rebellion. They were facing a continental awakening. In a matter of hours, the news of Morrison's failed escape attempt broke. Having tried to board a private jet at midnight, he was intercepted by special forces. His passport confiscated, he was escorted back to the capital, not as a guest, but as a detainee. Traoré made no secret of the move. In a televised address the next morning, he looked directly into the lens. James Morrison is under protective custody. He is safe, but he will answer to justice. We are not acting in rage, we are acting in defense. The implications were monumental. For the first time in history, an African head of state had detained a top World Bank official on charges of economic war crimes. Financial markets reacted violently. World Bank shares dropped 12% overnight. African-facing investment funds hemorrhaged capital. Wall Street entered a state of panic. In Nairobi, Lagos, Addis Ababa, rumors swirled. Would the West retaliate? Would sanctions be imposed? Would there be military consequences? But Traoré remained calm, as if the outcome had already been foretold. The international media tried to catch up. Journalists scrambled for sound bites. Analysts warned of instability. But inside Burkina Faso, the atmosphere was not one of fear, it was jubilation. In Thomas Sankara Square, over 100,000 people had gathered. Men with drums, women in traditional dress, children hoisted on shoulders, flags waving under the sun. Traoré addressed them not from a podium, but standing among them. "My brothers and sisters," he began, "today we declare our independence, not from nations, but from systems, from interests disguised as aid, from chains forged in the name of development." The crowd roared, elderly women wept, young boys chanted, "We are free!" And then something unexpected happened. China's foreign ministry issued a statement, "We support every nation's right to economic sovereignty." Shortly after, the China Development Bank offered to replace all of Burkina Faso's loans with interest-free alternatives. The West was stunned. The Russian Federation followed. A statement from Moscow read, "The so-called development model of the West in Africa is nothing but neo-colonialism." We commend President Traoré's courage. One by one, countries began to take sides, not based on alliances, but on principle. In India, Prime Minister Modi publicly declared, "Africa must rise. We stand with Burkina Faso's right to fairness." In Brazil, Lula da Silva echoed, "This is not rebellion, it is resistance. We too once broke our chains." And in South Africa, President Ramaphosa extended an invitation. Traoré is welcome in Pretoria. We have much to discuss. Even within Europe, cracks began to show. MPs in Spain and Portugal called for a full investigation into the World Bank's African activities. In Italy, a group of senators issued an open letter of solidarity. In Germany, voices from Die Linke stated, "We support Africa's rightful demands." Are you starting to see the bigger picture? If you're watching this, share your thoughts below. What side of history would you want your country to stand on? Burkina Faso, once dismissed as a marginal state, had now become the moral center of the global South. Not through war, not through wealth, but through truth. And Traoré had become more than a president. He had become a symbol. The footage was everywhere, on social media, on news loops, in underground cafes and elite salons. The same scene played over and over. James Morrison, wrists in handcuffs, being led into a black security van, flanked by soldiers. His eyes vacant, his voice silent. For the first time, a face had been given to the unseen machine of economic oppression. Western outlets either ignored the images or blurred them out. But it didn't matter. The internet had already immortalized the moment. In African capitals, street artists painted murals of Morrison behind bars. In villages, children mimicked the arrest during games. In every home, every school, one name was whispered with reverence: Traoré. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, global elites scrambled. Emergency meetings were held not just in the World Bank, but in IMF headquarters, in the European Commission, at the US State Department. Panic was no longer hidden. A leaked cable from a G7 ambassador read, "If other African countries follow suit, we could lose 2 generations of leverage in under a month." But still, Traoré stood firm. At midday, he delivered a second address, this time not in his capital, but to the world. Surrounded by African elders and children, he said, "We are not anti-West. We are anti-exploitation. We will work with any nation that respects our sovereignty, but we will no longer kneel." His words echoed from continent to continent. In Venezuela, President Maduro praised the move and offered discounts on petroleum exports to Burkina Faso. "The Bolivarian spirit now lives in Africa," he declared. Cuba responded by pledging to send doctors and teachers. Iran's foreign minister stated that the axis of resistance is expanding. And inside the World Bank itself, the walls were cracking. Staff members began leaking internal documents, emails revealing decades of financial entrapment, pressure campaigns on African leaders, covert media manipulation, and more. Some employees quietly sent their families home. Others resigned altogether. Across Africa, emboldened nations took action. Kenya suspended talks with the IMF. Zimbabwe announced a commission to review its debt structure. Ghana halted repayments pending a full audit. The dominoes had begun to fall. A new term emerged among analysts, the Traoré effect. Even the markets couldn't hide it. Gold prices soared. The CFA franc trembled. African currencies, once deemed weak, suddenly held strategic significance. Investment and analysts were forced to acknowledge that the balance of power was shifting, not because of guns or oil, but because of narrative. But perhaps the most powerful shift was psychological. For decades, African leaders had been taught to bow, to accept aid as a favor, to view debt as a tool, to see the World Bank as a guide. That myth was broken on live television, in broad daylight, by a man under 40 with nothing but paper in his hands and conviction in his voice. And if you're watching this and feel something, anger, pride, even disbelief, don't hold back. Drop your thoughts below. Would your country dare to do what Traoré has done? Because this story, this stand, it no longer belongs to just one nation. It belongs to every nation that's ever been told, you're not ready to stand on your own. Well, Traoré has shown that not only are they ready, they've already begun. As night blanketed Burkina Faso, the streets didn't sleep. Fires flickered in barrels, music poured from radios, and chants echoed from alleyways. In front of every World Bank office in the country, crowds stood vigil. It wasn't a protest anymore. It was a ceremony. The people had reclaimed something that couldn't be measured in currency: dignity. Across the city, walls were painted with messages like "Our wealth is ours, and we are not afraid anymore." In markets, vendors gave out bread for free. In schools, children drew pictures of Traoré standing over a globe. The elderly blessed him with the names of ancestors long gone. Churches rang their bells, mosques offered prayers. The air was filled not with fear, but with pride. Meanwhile, the political firestorm raged on. At the African Union's emergency summit, leaders lined up to speak. One after another, they praised Traoré, not just for his courage, but for revealing what so many had suspected but feared to say aloud. Guinea's President Mamadi Doumbouya put it plainly: he has done what many of us have only whispered. It is time to step into the light. A resolution was passed to form a continental audit body to investigate all foreign debt agreements. For the first time in the African Union's history, a motion directly targeting the World Bank was adopted with near unanimity. The West responded with veiled threats. The U.S. State Department released a statement urging Burkina Faso to respect international norms. France suspended aid. The IMF offered quiet backdoor negotiations, rescheduling, restructuring, anything but cancellation. But Traoré was unmoved. In a message broadcast live, he said, "We are not asking, we are deciding. The game is over." His words resonated across the diaspora. In France, tens of thousands of Burkinabés and Africans from other nations marched through the streets of Paris. They waved flags, carried placards bearing Morrison's mugshot, and chanted, "Africa is not for sale." In Lyon, students held a 3-day vigil outside the consulate. In Marseille, street performers reenacted Traoré's confrontation with Morrison. And in Berlin, graffiti appeared overnight on the walls of the World Bank's European office. Burkina Faso showed us the way. Western media struggled to control the narrative. The Financial Times published an editorial calling Traoré a threat to global financial stability. The BBC warned of possible coups in the region, but their efforts only amplified his message. And in Ouagadougou, preparations were underway for something no one expected: an international tribunal. Traoré announced that Morrison and his team would be tried publicly for economic war crimes. Lawyers from across the continent volunteered. Retired judges returned from exile. Even UN officials, quietly and unofficially, began to express interest in observing the trial. For the first time in history, a World Bank official would stand before an African court, not as a guest, but as an accused. If you're still watching this, pause and take it in. What we're witnessing is not just a rebellion, it's a rewriting of history. The question is, will the world listen? Will justice be allowed to unfold? Tell us what you think below. Should there be a full trial? Should other countries follow suit? Or is this the beginning of something far greater? Because one thing is clear, the floodgates are open, the silence has been broken, and the old rules no longer apply. As the world watched, something extraordinary began to unfold. Not in palaces or embassies, but in the minds and hearts of ordinary people. In African cities, towns, and remote villages, a quiet transformation was underway. For the first time in generations, people believed that change was not only possible, it had begun. The term Traoré effect spread beyond economic circles. Psychologists called it a recovery of suppressed agency. Cultural scholars compared it to the decolonization waves of the 1960s. Children in classrooms stood up to recite his speeches. Artists filled galleries with bold portraits of a man in military fatigues, fists clenched, eyes steady. But it wasn't only admiration, it was mobilization. In Ghana, university students organized week-long seminars titled "Debt is a Weapon." In South Africa, former anti-apartheid leaders returned to platforms they hadn't spoken from in decades, saying, "We see ourselves in him." In Nairobi, a new youth party was formed overnight, calling itself Sovereignty Now. Meanwhile, the trial preparations continued. The prosecution revealed more findings from Morrison's laptop, audio recordings of meetings where African officials were offered bribes in exchange for silence, a document detailing planned regime change in a non-compliant country, transaction records linking corrupt officials to European shell companies. Each revelation ignited a new fire. In Ivory Coast, the opposition called for all debt agreements to be made public. In Senegal, civil servants began leaking documents anonymously. The pattern was no longer hidden, it was undeniable. And yet, for all the evidence, some in the West still clung to the old narrative. It's dangerous populism, they said. He's destabilizing a fragile region. But that wasn't how Africans saw it. To them, Traoré wasn't destabilizing, he was clarifying, exposing, awakening. Even the African diaspora in the Americas rose. In Brazil, Afro-descendant communities held marches in Bahia and São Paulo. In the U.S., Black-led political organizations called for a full congressional hearing on American support to institutions like the World Bank. In Canada, professors published open letters demanding a global inquiry into debt colonialism. And the cultural world joined in. Musicians released anthems titled "Gold is Ours" and "Burkina Won't Bow." A documentary crew from Nigeria began filming a full-length series on the uprising. Filmmakers in Ethiopia and Mali announced co-productions about the trial. A Ghanaian poet wrote, "He did not raise a gun, he raised a folder, and the towers of debt began to shake." Perhaps the most telling sign of change was what happened in schools. In countries across Africa, students began asking new questions. Who lends to us? Where does our money go? Why do we build palaces before hospitals? If you're watching this video and you're a student, a teacher, a parent, think about what kind of future you want your children to inherit. Should they carry the same burdens? Or is it finally time to break the cycle? Drop your thoughts below. History doesn't belong only to those who lived it. It belongs to those who choose to shape it. And in that moment, one thing was undeniable. Africa had begun shaping its future, with no permission asked. As the sun rose over Ouagadougou, the courtroom stood silent, packed with journalists, diplomats, African elders, and young students. The trial of James Morrison was about to begin. It wasn't merely legal procedure, it was theater. It was memory. It was vengeance wrapped in dignity. Traoré didn't appear in military uniform that day. He wore a simple dark suit, standing quietly at the back before taking his seat. He wasn't the prosecutor nor the judge, but make no mistake, his presence filled every inch of that room. The charges were read aloud: economic war crimes, systematic plunder, violation of national sovereignty, conspiracy to suppress national development. Morrison sat in silence. Behind him, rows of former World Bank officials invited to testify fidgeted in discomfort. Outside, tens of thousands watched the proceedings on massive screens in the city squares. Some prayed, others simply stared, unblinking. But the trial was more than a legal matter. It was a mirror. Country after country sent representatives. Some in quiet support, others with eyes wide in disbelief. For every page of evidence shown, for every email, every bank transfer, every bribery receipt, a wound was opened. And with each wound came healing. Then came the moment that defined it all. The prosecution played an audio clip recorded secretly in 2017. Morrison's voice, clear and confident, said, "We don't need to build schools. We just need them to think we are." The courtroom gasped, but it wasn't rage that followed. It was resolve. After the clip, a teacher from a rural village stood to testify. "I've taught for 30 years under trees, without chalk, without books. And still, they told us we were poor because we were lazy. Today, I know that was a lie." One by one, witnesses from across the continent spoke. Farmers, midwives, students, accountants. Their voices didn't cry for pity. They demanded recognition, and they received it. Across Africa, national parliaments began reopening old contracts. Debts were questioned, budgets restructured. The fear of speaking truth had evaporated. Even within the World Bank, resignations piled up. A small group of reformers began advocating for internal investigation. But for many Africans, the answer was clear. The time of begging for reform was over. The time of building alternatives had begun. At the end of the week, the tribunal delivered its verdict: guilty on all counts. The sentence was symbolic, not cruel. Morrison would not be jailed for life. He would be required to stay in Burkina Faso for 5 years, during which he would work on rebuilding the very communities his decisions had harmed. His reaction? Numb silence. And then Traoré took the podium one last time. He looked not at the courtroom, but at the camera lens. "Let this be remembered not as a punishment, but as a beginning. We are not angry, we are awake, and we are not alone." Applause erupted, not choreographed, not forced, pure, thunderous applause from a people who had waited too long to feel whole. In the following weeks, other African leaders followed Traoré's path. Laws were passed protecting natural resources. Regional banks were established. Media organizations formed coalitions to protect local narratives from foreign manipulation. The Traoré doctrine, economic sovereignty through transparency and dignity, began spreading beyond borders. In France, students marched under banners that read, "Our debt is colonial too." In Chile, posters of Traoré appeared next to Salvador Allende. In India, social justice activists named a protest camp, Ouagadougou Square. And in Burkina Faso, life returned to rhythm but not routine. Markets opened, schools reopened, but this time textbooks told the truth. Murals of Thomas Sankara now stood side by side with portraits of Traoré. A new holiday was declared, Liberation Day. If you've come this far, ask yourself, what would you have done if you were in Traoré's place? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have stood? Let us know in the comments, because silence too has a cost, and now that silence is broken. Africa will never be the same again. Breaking news from the heart of West Africa has stirred global attention. Something unprecedented has just unfolded in Burkina Faso. This isn't merely a domestic affair, it's a challenge to decades of financial domination. President Ibrahim Traoré, young yet resolute, stood before the cameras this morning with a calm fury in his eyes. Behind him, the national flag swayed gently, and on the table beside him lay documents that carried the weight of betrayal. Today, he began, we unmask 50 years of deception. This was not rhetoric, it was revolution. Everything had started with a quiet internal audit. A special commission under the Ministry of Finance, composed of young, sharp-minded economists, had taken a closer look at Burkina Faso's historical agreements with the World Bank. What they discovered shook them to the core. Since gaining independence, Burkina Faso had borrowed billions, yet paid back far more in interest. According to the Commission's report, the country had repaid 15 times its original debt, on paper. But the actual benefit to the nation? Barely measurable. Hospitals, roads, schools, projects supposedly funded had no physical trace. Many of these developments existed only in ink and signatures. Their funds vanished through complex webs of kickbacks and offshore transfers. Worse still, a classified protocol from 2019 revealed that 40% of the nation's gold reserves had been pledged as collateral to the World Bank, without parliamentary approval. One cannot overstate the gravity of such a revelation. Traoré summoned the regional director of the World Bank, James Morrison, to the palace. Morrison believed he was attending a standard review meeting. He was wrong. "You've drained this nation's blood," Traoré said, placing a stack of files between them. "Phantom loans, fake projects, and interest without mercy. We've paid $23 billion on a $4 billion debt." When Morrison attempted to respond, Traoré raised his hand. "Spare me the procedures, cancel our debt, or stand trial." Outside, protests began. Inside, the fire had already been lit. The palace held a late-night press conference. Traoré addressed not just Burkina Faso, but all of Africa. "Our fathers were tricked, our grandfathers betrayed, but we will no longer be silent." He held up the proof, contracts, receipts, secret protocols. The footage spread like wildfire. Thousands flooded the streets. In Mali, President Goïta pledged support. Niger called for a Sahel-wide review of all foreign debt. Guinea, Uganda, and even South Africa followed. The West panicked. Paris sent envoys. Washington issued warnings. Traoré refused all backdoor negotiations. "This time we decide," he said. James Morrison attempted to flee. He was stopped at the airport, his passport revoked. He was escorted back under guard. "He is under protective custody," Traoré told the press. Safe, but accountable. In Washington, the World Bank went into crisis mode. Investors panicked. Shares plunged. Inside Burkina Faso, however, there was only pride. Children painted pictures of Traoré. Elders wept and prayed. A new spirit was awakening. Security forces raided World Bank offices. What they found went beyond corruption. Morrison's laptop contained a document titled "How to Keep Poor Countries in Debt Forever." Bribery records, coup strategies, a blueprint for control. Traoré sent everything to the International Criminal Court. "This is bigger than us," he said. "It's a crime against Africa." The African Union convened an emergency summit. 41 states stood behind Burkina Faso. A new commission was formed to investigate all foreign lending. The West warned of isolation. African media called it independence. The cultural reaction was just as powerful. Music, poems, murals, all praising resistance. Hashtags like #AfricaRises and #Traoré Effect trended globally. People in the diaspora marched in Paris, New York, and Rio. In schools across Africa, children began asking, "Why do we owe so much?" Morrison was charged with economic war crimes. The evidence was overwhelming. Audio clips revealed callous strategy. "They don't need schools. Just think we built them." A teacher testified, 30 years with no chalk, no books, and we were told we were lazy. It was a lie. At the verdict, the court ruled guilty. He would serve 5 years in Burkina Faso, repairing what had been destroyed. Traoré addressed the world. Let this be a beginning, not revenge, justice. Their countries began reviewing their contracts. Some tore them up. The myth of the benevolent lender had been broken. Global figures responded. Lula, Modi, Ramaphosa, each echoed the same truth. The time of silence is over. Even within Europe, dissent grew. In the US, Congress members began questioning foreign aid. The shock was worldwide. Back home, a new holiday was declared. Liberation Day. Books were rewritten, monuments were built. Schools began teaching the truth. If you followed this story until now, reflect. What would your leaders have done? Would they have stood tall or stayed silent? Let us know in the comments. Your voice matters because in the end, it wasn't just about one country, it was about all of us. And the silence is finally broken.